Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're starting a new book. That is the book of 1 Samuel. And we're going to do chapters 1, 2, and 3 today. Tomorrow we're going to do 1 Samuel chapter 4 through 8. That's right, 5 chapters tomorrow. 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. But today it's just 1 through 3. So as we start a new book, I'd like to give you a little intro. Nobody really knows who wrote the book of Samuel. They think it was written that Samuel was largely responsible for at least the first part of the content through chapter 25, but maybe Nathan and Gad, that were prophets, probably gave some significant input on the rest. It was originally one book. 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book together, but they got split up later on. It was probably written around 930 BC, is what they're saying. The big picture here about Samuel, if we think about this from a broader perspective after reading the whole book, this is about Samuel's leadership as a judge. The first people of Israel turned to Saul as their first king, who God later rejected and instead chose David, who had many adventures as a renegade from Saul's court. So we got some good stories in the book of Samuel. And we'll dive right into it. One of the main takeaways from the book of Samuel that I got was when leaders focus their attention on the Lord and see their leadership roles as instruments for His glory, then they flourish. But when they abandon the Lord and use their offices for their own gain, they tend to fail and lead their people down a hole with them. So that's my main takeaway from the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd. So we start out in chapter 1. This guy, Elkanah, the son of Jeroboam, he had 2 wives. The first one was named Hannah, and the second was, I can't pronounce it, Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. She had no children. Now, whenever Elkanah would offer sacrifices, burnt offerings, and they divvy out the meat to his wife and his sons and daughters, he always gave a double portion to Hannah. And that double portion, if you think about it, that was the same amount of the inheritance of the firstborn sons when a father passed away. That's how much they received. That was from Deuteronomy chapter 21 when we learned about that. I found that interesting, the double portion. The word was used again here in this scenario. Now the name Hannah, who we're talking about here, actually means grace. And year after year, Hannah's story was kind of sad, really. People taunted her because she didn't have any kids, and they would just taunt her relentlessly, and she would cry about this. On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh, and she prayed to the Lord. And Hannah did a lot of praying. She was a prayer. She talked to the Lord a lot. She pleaded with the Lord and said, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. His hair will never be cut. We've heard that before, haven't we, too, with Samson, the Nazarite? Well, she has vowed to God that if she gets a son, if God gives her a son, she's going to have him raised as a Nazarite as well, dedicating him to God. Well, later on, Hannah and her husband were intimate, and the Lord remembered her. I found it interesting that Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, and because she had said, I requested him from the Lord. Now, the name Samuel itself, it may be a wordplay here in the Bible, because one meaning is requested from God, which is in my version here, the CSB, but in other versions it means heard by God. So Samuel could mean heard by God, it could mean requested from God. And we'll move on from there. Now, after she said that after the child is weaned, she's going to take him to appear in the Lord's presence and to stay there permanently. She was telling her husband this when her husband said, hey, what are we going to do with this kid? And her husband basically replied to her and said, "Do whatever you think's best. That sounds good to me." Now, in Israel, children were weaned at the age of 3. It may seem a little bit old to us, but that's how it worked back then. At the end of chapter 1, it says, Hannah says, "I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord gave me what I asked for, I now give the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord." So she basically dedicated to him as a Nazarite child. So there is Papa and Mama and Samuel right there. And then we have Hannah's triumphant prayer. And she prayed this long prayer. We get to verse 11. Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy served the Lord in the presence of the priest Eli. So, we get to the priest Eli. Let's talk about Eli for a minute. Now, Eli, he had these 2 sons. And these sons, they were wicked dudes, okay? They were very disrespectful. They were not what a priestly group of gentlemen should be. They were stealing stuff from people. They were taking more than their fair share of the food and the sacrifice food, as you see in this picture here. It talks about how they'd stick the fork down in the meat while it was still boiling, when it was still even half raw, and they would just take whatever came out. They would just claim for themselves whatever the fork brought up and say, "This is mine." When anybody contested, they'd say, "No." They basically said, "Hand it over right now, and if you don't, I'm going to take it by force." They were that mean of dudes. And they treated the Lord with contempt as well, even though Eli was a priest. Now, Samuel served the Lord all the way through all of this. And Eli blessed their family. Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and they ended up having 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. And chapter 2, verse 21, it says, "The Lord paid attention to Hannah's need." And that literally meant Yahweh visited Hannah. This same Hebrew expression occurs in the reference to Abraham's wife, Sarah, when she conceived Isaac, another child of promise that we read about already in Genesis chapter 21. Now, at this point, Eli was very old, and he had heard about everything that his sons were doing. And he goes to them and says, "Hey, I've heard about all the evil actions that you're doing to these people. What you got to say for yourself? But, and you need to stop this stuff." But they wouldn't listen to him. They didn't listen, and as it turns out, God intended to kill them over their transgressions here. But by contrast, we have Samuel on the other hand, who grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with the people. People were starting to love Samuel. We get to verse 30 over here. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. We'll come back to verse 30 in a minute. He's basically, God is ill. Therefore, this is the declaration of the Lord, the God of Israel. I did say that your family and your forefathers' family would walk before me forever, but now this is the Lord's declaration no longer. For those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me will be disgraced. All your descendants will die violently, as it says in verse 33. Concerning your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, both of them will die on the same day. And we do see that prophecy is fulfilled later on. Now we get to chapter 3. This is Samuel's call. This is Samuel being called to God's service. The boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and prophetic visions were not widespread. We're already back to that same scenario here in the United States today. There in Israel, it was rare that people lived a godly life. And we see this throughout the Bible, how many times the Israelites were sinful and would worship other gods and did other bad things. This time was a very corrupt time, and we're back in it again. Samuel was lying down one night, and he heard the Lord call him, but he didn't know it was the Lord. The Lord said, "Samuel," and Samuel jumped up and said, "Here I am," and he ran to Eli, thinking it was Eli. And Eli said, "Well, I didn't call you, go back to bed." And this happened 3 times. Now after the 3rd time, when the 4th time after the third time, Samuel said, "That must be the Lord talking to you. Go lay back down. If he calls it again, answer him from there." So he does, and the Lord says, "Samuel, Samuel," and Samuel responds, "Speak for your servant is listening." And God said, "I'm about to do something. I'm about to do something against Eli, and I'm going to judge his family. His sons are cursing God." And Samuel was afraid to tell Eli what had happened, but Eli called to Samuel and said, "Hey, what God tell you? And don't lie to me about it." So Samuel told him everything, and Eli's response was, actually, I thought was kind of humble. He said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks is good." And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him. Samuel was confirmed a prophet of the Lord. And that's the end of Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1, 2, and 3. Now let's go back to verse 30 there. In the middle of verse 30 it says, "For those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me will be disgraced." Now this reminds me, when I think of honor, I think of how our country was founded and who some of our founders were. And one in particular, George Washington. He gave a speech at one time on July the 2nd, 1776. Actually, these were orders that he'd written. It wasn't a speech. It was some orders that he had written to his men. And on July 2nd, 1776, as the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to declare independence, Commander-in-Chief George Washington was gathered his troops on Long Island to meet the British in battle in and around New York City. He wrote in the general orders to his men that day these memorable words, which declare that we, as a nation, serve under God. Here's what George Washington said. He said, "The time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and they consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will probably deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemies leave us no choice but a brave resistance, or the most abject submission. This is all we can expect. We have therefore resolved to conquer or die, our own country's honor. All call upon us for a vigorous and manly exertion, and if we now shamefully fail, we shall become infamous to the whole world. Let us therefore rely on goodness of the cause and the aid of the Supreme Being, in whose hands victory is, to animate and encourage us to great and noble actions. The eyes of all our countrymen are now upon us, and we shall have their blessings and praises, if happily we are the instruments of saving them from the tyranny meditated against them. Let us therefore animate and encourage each other, and show the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth." Wow. "For those who honor me, I will honor." 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. For those who honor me, I will honor. Now, do you still think that we're not a Christian nation? I think we were founded as one, and people are in denial about that. Well, I hope this has touched you. If it has, hit the like button and the subscribe button, and of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And I hope to see you tomorrow for 1 Samuel chapter 4 through chapter 8. We'll see you then.